They heard them before they saw them. On the morning of March 6, 1943, Luftwaffe officers standing on the observation platform of the Reich Air Ministry building in Berlin counted aircraft contrails spreading across the sky like chalk marks on a blackboard. One officer began counting aloud. 10, 20, 40. He stopped at 67 distinct contrails, each one representing a 4-engine American bomber at altitude. The flak batteries had already opened fire, filling the sky with black puffs of exploding shells. The officer turned to his colleague and said something that would be recorded in the daily intelligence summary. "There are more bombers over Berlin this morning than we calculated would exist in the entire American heavy bomber force." He was wrong about the total number. American industrial production had already exceeded his highest estimates. But he was right to be shocked. German air defense planning, meticulously prepared over years of analysis and intelligence gathering, had just collided with a reality they had not anticipated. The calculations had been thorough, rational, based on the best information available to German military intelligence. They had estimated American production capacity, factored in training time, accounted for losses in transit and combat operations. Their conclusion had been reassuring. The United States might eventually field a substantial bomber force, but it would take years to build, and would never reach the numbers that would truly threaten German cities. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. That morning in March proved those calculations catastrophically wrong, but the error had not been made overnight. It was the product of assumptions built carefully over years, rooted in German understanding of industrial warfare, aviation technology, and strategic bombing theory. 2. Understand how German planners arrived at their estimates, and why those estimates failed so completely, requires going back to the moment when they first began calculating what America might do if it entered the war. The planning had started in earnest in 1939, when the outbreak of war in Europe made American intervention a possibility that German strategists had to consider. The Oberkommando der Luftwaffe, the High Command of the German Air Force, tasked its intelligence branch with producing estimates of potential American air power. The officers assigned to this task were competent, experienced men who had spent their careers studying aviation and military production. They approached the problem methodically, gathering data on American aircraft, manufacturing capacity, pilot training infrastructure, and stated military doctrine. Their analysis would shape German defensive preparations for years to come, and it would prove to be almost entirely wrong. The German intelligence assessment of American bomber capability began with what seemed like solid reasoning. The United States, in 1939, had a modest air force. The Army Air Corps, as it was then called, possessed fewer than 2,000 aircraft of all types. Of these, only a handful were heavy bombers. The B-17 Flying Fortress, which would later become the backbone of American strategic bombing, existed in tiny numbers. Boeing had delivered exactly 13 B-17s to the Air Corps by the end of 1939. German intelligence officers examining these facts saw an American military aviation sector that was small, underfunded, and focused primarily on hemispheric defense rather than power projection. They noted that American aircraft production in 1939 totaled approximately 5,800 planes of all types, including civilian aircraft, trainers, and light observation planes. Germany, by comparison, had produced over 8,000 military aircraft in the same year. The conclusion seemed obvious. America was years behind in aviation development and production, but the German analysis went deeper than simple production numbers. Intelligence officers studied American industrial structure, trying to understand the nation's capacity to expand aircraft manufacturing. What they found seemed to support their assessment that American bomber production would remain limited. The American aviation industry in 1939 consisted of a relatively small number of specialized firms. Boeing, Douglas, Consolidated, North American Aviation, and a handful of others produced aircraft in dedicated factories designed specifically for airplane construction. These facilities were sophisticated but limited in scale. The largest, the Douglas plant in Santa Monica, California, employed roughly 6,000 workers and could produce perhaps 50 aircraft per month at maximum capacity. German analysts noted that expanding aircraft production would require building new factories, training new workers, developing supply chains for specialized components, and establishing quality control systems. This was not something that could be done quickly. Aircraft manufacturing required precision engineering, skilled labor, and complex coordination between thousands of subcontractors, producing everything from engines to instruments to armaments. The Germans had themselves spent years building up their aviation industry. They assumed, reasonably from their perspective, that America would face similar constraints. The intelligence reports also examined American strategic doctrine. Pre-war American military planning had focused heavily on coastal defense and protection of the Western Hemisphere. The Air Corps Tactical School at Maxwell Field in Alabama had developed theories of strategic bombing, but these remained largely theoretical. America had no experience conducting long-range bombing campaigns. It had no established doctrine for deep penetration raids into heavily defended airspace. It had not developed the navigation techniques, formation tactics, or defensive armament systems that such operations would require. German analysts noted all of this. They concluded that even if America built a substantial bomber force, it would take years of operational experience to make it effective. The German calculations also factored in geography and logistics. American heavy bombers would have to operate from bases in England to reach German targets. This meant transporting not just aircraft, but entire support infrastructures across the Atlantic. Each bomber required ground crews, mechanics, armorers, fuel trucks, bomb-loading equipment, spare parts, and thousands of other items. A single B-17 required approximately 50 ground personnel to maintain and operate. Multiplied across hundreds of bombers, this meant tens of thousands of support personnel who would need to be trained, equipped, transported, and sustained in England. German intelligence officers calculated that this logistical challenge would severely limit the scale of American bombing operations. They estimated that America might eventually station perhaps 300 heavy bombers in England, operating in groups of 50 to 100 aircraft per mission. This seemed like a reasonable upper limit given the constraints of training, production, and logistics. 300 bombers would be a significant force, certainly enough to require serious defensive preparations, but manageable within Germany's existing air defense framework. The framework was substantial. By 1941, Germany had constructed an integrated air defense system covering the Reich and occupied territories. The system combined early warning radar stations along the coast, fighter control centers coordinating interceptor aircraft, and thousands of anti-aircraft guns protecting major cities and industrial centers. The flak arm of the Luftwaffe, responsible for anti-aircraft defense, employed over 1 million personnel, operating guns ranging from small 20mm cannons to massive 128mm pieces that could reach bombers at 30,000 feet. Berlin itself was defended by 3 flak divisions, totaling over 400 heavy anti-aircraft guns arranged in concentric rings around the city. The guns were organized into batteries of 4 to 8 pieces, coordinated by fire control centers equipped with optical rangefinders and mechanical calculators. Each battery could put up a barrage of shells, creating a box of exploding metal that bombers had to fly through. The system was designed to handle raids of up to 100 aircraft at a time, with the capacity to expand if necessary. Fighter defense added another layer. The Luftwaffe maintained fighter groups equipped with Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf Foftu 190s, single-engine fighters capable of intercepting bombers before they reached their targets. Later, specialized heavy fighters like the Bf 110 and Me 410 would be introduced specifically for bomber interception, carrying heavy cannon armament designed to destroy four-engine aircraft with a few well-placed hits. German pilots had extensive combat experience from campaigns in Poland, France, and the ongoing war against Britain. They were confident in their ability to inflict severe losses on American bomber formations. This confidence was not unfounded. The Luftwaffe had already demonstrated its capability against British bombers. In 1941 and early 1942, when the Royal Air Force attempted daylight bombing raids over occupied Europe, German fighters had inflicted devastating losses. The RAF quickly abandoned daylight operations in favor of night bombing, accepting reduced accuracy in exchange for lower loss rates. German planners assumed American bombers would face similar challenges. Even if the United States built several hundred heavy bombers and stationed them in England, German defenses would make daylight operations prohibitively costly. The reality that German planners failed to anticipate was already taking shape in American factories by the time their intelligence assessments were complete. On January 16, 1942, just weeks after Pearl Harbor, the United States War Production Board issued orders for a massive expansion of aircraft manufacturing. The scale of the program would have seemed impossible to German analysts who had studied American industrial capacity through the lens of peacetime production. The expansion began not by building more specialized aircraft factories, but by converting existing automotive and industrial plants to aircraft production. The Ford Motor Company's Willow Run facility in Michigan became the centerpiece of this transformation. Henry Ford, who had revolutionized automobile manufacturing with assembly line production, applied the same principles to building B-24 Liberator bombers. The Willow Run plant covered 3.5 million square feet under one roof, making it the largest single factory building in the world at that time. When fully operational, the plant would produce one complete B-24 every 63 minutes. This was production at a scale German intelligence had not conceived possible for aircraft manufacturing. The traditional aircraft factory, with skilled craftsmen building planes almost individually, was being replaced by an assembly line, where workers with minimal training could install prefabricated sections. Parts were standardized across multiple manufacturers. Engines built in Connecticut could be installed on airframes assembled in Texas or California. Wings manufactured in one plant were shipped to final assembly facilities hundreds of miles away. The entire American industrial economy was being reorganized around war. Production. Boeing's Seattle plant, which had delivered 13 B-17s in 1939, was expanded and supplemented by new facilities. The Boeing plant in Renton, Washington, was built specifically for B-29 production. Douglas opened a massive facility in Tulsa, Oklahoma, for bomber production. Consolidated built plants in Fort Worth, Texas, and San Diego, California. Each facility employed tens of thousands of workers operating multiple shifts around the clock. The workforce included women in unprecedented numbers, taking positions in welding, riveting, and assembly that had been exclusively male in peacetime. By 1943, women constituted over 40% of aircraft manufacturing workers in some facilities. The training pipeline expanded in parallel with production. In 1939, the Army Air Corps had graduated fewer than 300 pilots. By 1943, American flight training schools were producing over 4,000 pilots per month. New training bases were constructed across the southern United States, taking advantage of clear weather for year-round flying. Maxwell Field, Randolph Field, Williams Field, and dozens of others turned civilians into combat pilots in programs lasting 6 to 9 months. Multi-engine training specifically for heavy bomber pilots was conducted at fields like Roswell, New Mexico, and Peyote, Texas, where B-17 and B-24 crews learned formation, flying, navigation, and bombing procedures. The logistics system to support bomber operations in England grew with similar intensity. The United States Army Services of Supply, later renamed Army Service Forces, organized shipments of personnel, aircraft, spare parts, ammunition, fuel, and equipment across the Atlantic. Bombers flew the northern route through Newfoundland, Greenland, and Iceland to reach England, while ships carried the heavy equipment and supplies. By mid-1943, over 150,000 American personnel were stationed at bases across England, creating what was essentially an American city dedicated to strategic bombing. The 8th Air Force, established in England in May 1942, grew from a handful of groups to a force that would eventually field over 2,000 heavy bombers. German intelligence tracked some of this expansion through various sources. Reconnaissance flights photographed new airfields being constructed in England. Signal intelligence intercepted radio traffic. Neutral diplomats and journalists reported on American industrial mobilization. But the reports were fragmented, contradictory, and difficult to believe. The numbers seemed too large. When intelligence officers presented estimates suggesting American bomber production might reach 500 aircraft per month, senior Luftwaffe commanders dismissed the figures as impossible. No nation could produce heavy bombers at such rates. The math did not work within their understanding of industrial aviation. The first American heavy bomber raid on Germany occurred on January 27, 1943, when 64 B-17s attacked the naval base at Wilhelmshaven. German fighters intercepted the formation, shooting down 3 bombers. Flak batteries damaged several others. The Luftwaffe commanders who reviewed the engagement reports considered it a successful defense. The Americans had mounted a raid of approximately the size German planning had anticipated. The defenders had inflicted acceptable losses. The system was working as designed, but in the intelligence briefings that followed, details emerged that troubled some officers. The American bombers had flown in tight formation, maintaining discipline under fire. Their defensive armament, 13 50 caliber machine guns per aircraft, created overlapping fields of fire that made close attacks costly for German fighters. The bombing accuracy, while not perfect, was better than expected for crews operating over Germany for the first time. Most significantly, interrogations of captured American airmen revealed that the raid represented only a small fraction of the bomber force being assembled in England. The prisoners spoke casually of hundreds of bombers arriving monthly, of dozens of airfields being constructed, of production that seemed unlimited. German intelligence officers filed reports noting these claims, but remained skeptical. Prisoners exaggerated. They repeated propaganda they had been told. The real numbers, the analysts believed, would be lower. The next major raid, on March 6 against Berlin, forced a reassessment. The raid involved over 200 American bombers escorted by fighters. German defenses destroyed 9 bombers and damaged many others, but the scale of the attack exceeded planning assumptions. More raids followed in quick succession: Kiel on March 13th, Bremen on March 18th. Each raid involved between 150 and 200 bombers. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The pattern became clear through the spring and summer of 1943. American bomber strength in England was not stabilizing at 300 aircraft, as German planning had projected. It was growing continuously. By June, the 8th Air Force could dispatch over 300 bombers on a single mission. By August, raids of 400 to 500 aircraft were routine. The numbers kept increasing. Intelligence officers revised their estimates upward, but each revision proved conservative within weeks. On August 17, 1943, the 8th Air Force launched what would become known as Black Thursday, though that name would later be applied to a different raid. 376 bombers attacked ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt and aircraft plants at Regensburg. German fighters rose to meet them in the largest air battle yet fought over Germany. The Luftwaffe destroyed 60 bombers, a victory by any measure of combat effectiveness. But German pilots landing at their bases after the battle reported something that shocked their commanders. There had been so many bombers that destroying 60 barely seemed to reduce their numbers. Squadron leaders filed combat reports describing formations that stretched for miles, box after box of 4-engine bombers filling the sky. Fighter pilots who expended all their ammunition attacking one formation would disengage only to see another formation approaching. The Americans were not sending everything they had and hoping for victory. They were sending a fraction of their force and accepting losses as acceptable costs. Luftwaffe intelligence officers calculating American losses against replacement rates made an uncomfortable discovery. At current loss rates, which were higher than the Americans, could sustain indefinitely, it would take years to deplete the bomber force being built in the United States. The industrial numbers, when German intelligence finally compiled them with reasonable accuracy, revealed the scale of miscalculation. American aircraft production in 1943 reached 85,000 aircraft of all types. Of these, over 9,000 were heavy bombers, B-17s and B-24s. This was not the gradual expansion German planners had predicted. This was mass production at rates that exceeded Germany's entire aircraft output, and the Americans were simultaneously building fighters, transports, trainers, and naval aircraft in similar quantities. The Willow Run plant alone produced over 400 B-24s per month at peak output in late 1943. Boeing's combined facilities produced similar numbers of B-17s. The American aviation industry had achieved what German analysts had declared impossible, converting mass production techniques developed for automobiles to the manufacture of complex 4-engine bombers. Each aircraft rolled off the assembly line fully equipped with navigation instruments, radio equipment, defensive armament, and bombing systems. They were not crude emergency productions. They were sophisticated combat aircraft built to standardized specifications that made them interchangeable and maintainable in the field. The logistical infrastructure supporting these bombers in England expanded proportionally. American air bases covered eastern England, transforming rural counties into military installations. Each base housed a bomb group of 48 to 72 aircraft plus reserves. Ground crews numbered in the thousands per base. Fuel farms stored aviation gasoline delivered by tankers from American refineries. Ammunition dumps held bombs ranging from 100-pound general-purpose weapons to 2,000-pound armor-piercing bombs. Maintenance facilities could rebuild damaged aircraft or cannibalize irreparable ones for spare parts. German reconnaissance flights over England in late 1943 counted over 100 airfields with visible bomber concentrations. Photographic interpreters estimated 1,500 to 2,000 heavy bombers based in England, with more arriving continuously. The Luftwaffe operations staff revised defensive plans to account for raids of up to 600 bombers, double the original planning assumption. Within months, even this revision proved inadequate. By early 1944, the 8th Air Force routinely dispatched over 700 bombers on major raids. On some days, multiple raids targeted different cities simultaneously, forcing German defences to split their fighter forces. The psychological impact on German fighter pilots and flak crews was profound. A Luftwaffe pilot who had flown combat missions since 1940 described the change in an interrogation after his capture in March 1944. In the early raids, he explained, German fighters could see the entire American formation and develop tactical plans for attack. By late 1943, the formations were so large that pilots could see only the section they were attacking. The sky was filled with bombers in every direction. Attacking one formation meant ignoring three others. Even successful attacks that destroyed 5 or 6 bombers barely affected the raid's outcome. The Americans kept coming, kept bombing, kept accepting losses that would have grounded any European air force. Flak battery commanders reported similar experiences. Their guns could fire only so many shells per minute. Their targeting systems could track only so many aircraft simultaneously. When 50 bombers approached, the system worked. When 200 approached, coverage had gaps. When 500 approached, vast portions of the formation flew through without effective engagement. The batteries fired until their barrels overheated, until ammunition stocks ran low, until crews collapsed from exhaustion. The bombers kept coming. Orders from Luftwaffe headquarters demanded better results, higher kill rates, more aggressive tactics, but the mathematics were unforgiving. Germany simply did not have enough fighters, enough pilots, enough guns, or enough ammunition to stop raids of this scale. The peak of American bombing operations over Germany came in the spring and summer of 1944, after the 8th Air Force gained escort fighters with sufficient range to accompany bombers to any target in Germany. The P-51 Mustang, equipped with drop tanks, could escort bombers to Berlin and back, a capability that fundamentally changed the air war. German fighters that had previously attacked bomber formations with relative impunity now faced enemy fighters with performance equal or superior to their own. The advantage shifted decisively to the attackers. On March 6, 1944, exactly 1 year after the raid that had shocked the Luftwaffe observer in Berlin, over 700 American heavy bombers attacked Berlin in daylight. The raid was one of multiple strikes that day, targeting various German cities. Flak batteries around Berlin fired over 20,000 shells. Fighter units threw everything available against the formations. The Americans lost 69 bombers, the highest single-day loss of the war to that point. But the raid continued. The bombs fell. The next day, 600 bombers returned. The day after, 500 more. The campaign was relentless, absorbing losses that would have been catastrophic by any previous standard of air warfare, and continuing without pause. German production statistics from 1944 reveal the impact of this sustained bombing. Aircraft production actually increased through the first half of the year despite the raids, reaching peak output in July, when German factories delivered over 3,000 fighters. But the production came at enormous cost in resources, labor, and defensive effort. Factories were dispersed into smaller facilities to reduce vulnerability. Production was moved underground into mines and tunnels. Quality control suffered as inexperienced workers replaced skilled craftsmen called to military service. The transportation network that delivered components to assembly plants and finished aircraft to operational units was progressively degraded by bombing of rail yards and bridges. More significantly, the bombing campaign forced Germany to divert resources from offensive operations to defense. Fighter production took priority over bombers, reconnaissance aircraft, and transports. Pilots were trained for defense of the Reich rather than ground support on the Eastern Front. Anti-aircraft guns that could have been used as anti-tank weapons or field artillery were kept in Germany protecting cities and industries. By late 1944, over 1 million personnel were assigned to air defense duties, including hundreds of thousands of young men who could have served in combat divisions. The strategic bombing campaign was achieving its goal not primarily through destruction of factories, though that occurred, but through forcing Germany to allocate vast resources to defense. The human cost was measured differently on each side. American bomber crews faced casualty rates among the highest of any branch of service. The 8th Air Force lost over 26,000 men killed in action and over 20,000 taken prisoner. Statistical analysis showed that a bomber crewman completing the required 25 missions, later increased to 35, had approximately a 50% chance of being killed, wounded, or captured. Crews understood these odds. They flew anyway, mission after mission, watching other aircraft go down, seeing friends fail to return, and climbing back into their bombers the next day because the missions continued and the war demanded it. German defenders suffered comparable losses in different forms. Luftwaffe fighter pilots in 1944 faced odds far worse than American bomber crews. Life expectancy for new pilots assigned to defense of the Reich was measured in weeks. Experienced pilots who survived into late 1944 had flown hundreds of combat sorties, far more than was considered sustainable. Many of Germany's most skilled pilots died in this period, not because they lacked ability, but because they faced overwhelming numbers day after day until probability caught up with them. Flak crews endured bombing raids while trying to shoot down the bombers, suffering casualties from American bombs falling on their gun positions. Civilian casualties in bombed cities numbered in the hundreds of thousands, with German estimates suggesting over 400,000 killed by air raids during the entire war. The final year of the war demonstrated what happened when German air defences, progressively worn down by attrition and fuel shortages, could no longer mount effective resistance. By early 1945, the 8th Air Force was joined by the 15th Air Force operating from Italy, creating a two-front air campaign that Germany could not defend against. Raids of over 1,000 bombers became routine. On some days, 1,500 to 2,000 American heavy bombers attacked targets across Germany simultaneously. The Luftwaffe, critically short of fuel after the bombing of synthetic oil plants, could mount only limited interceptor missions. Many fighter aircraft sat grounded on airfields, fully armed and ready but without fuel to fly. The contrast with German planning assumptions from 4 years earlier was absolute. The intelligence officers who had predicted 300 American bombers as an upper limit had underestimated actual deployment by a factor of 7. The production estimates had been wrong by an order of magnitude. The assessment of American industrial capacity had failed to account for the nation's ability to mobilize its automotive industry, retool entire factories, and apply mass production techniques to aircraft manufacturing. Most fundamentally, German planners had not understood that American strategic doctrine accepted levels of aircraft loss that European air forces considered unsustainable. This difference in doctrine reflected deeper differences in industrial philosophy and strategic thinking. Germany had built an air force designed for short, decisive campaigns supporting ground operations. The Luftwaffe had performed brilliantly in Poland, France, and the early years in the Soviet Union, but it was not designed for a multi-year strategic bombing campaign requiring continuous replacement of losses. German aircraft production, while substantial, could not keep pace with attrition rates once the fighting became sustained warfare on multiple fronts. The United States had designed its bomber force specifically for sustained strategic operations. The entire system, from training to production to logistics, was built around the assumption that losses would be high and must be continuously replaced. The documents captured after Germany's surrender included Luftwaffe intelligence files showing the progression of their estimates of American bomber strength. Early reports from 1942 predicted peak strength of 300 to 400 aircraft. Revisions in mid-1943 increased estimates to 600. By late 1943, intelligence officers were reporting over 1,500 heavy bombers in England, with production rates suggesting continuous growth. By 1944, the reports stopped trying to predict American capacity and simply recorded observed strength, which by war's end exceeded 4,000 heavy bombers in Europe alone, not counting the additional thousands being produced for operations against Japan. The air campaign's effectiveness remains debated among historians. Post-war analysis by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey concluded that the bombing had significantly disrupted German production and transportation, but not enough to cripple the German economy until the final months of the war. German production actually increased through 1944 despite the bombing, suggesting that dispersal and hardening of facilities provided some protection. However, the survey also concluded that without the bombing, German production would have been substantially higher, perhaps enough to significantly prolong the war. The diversion of resources to air defense, the loss of skilled workers and facilities, and the progressive destruction of the transportation network all contributed to Germany's defeat. What is undeniable is the psychological impact on both sides. For American bomber crews, the missions over Germany represented a test of endurance and courage unlike any other in the war. They flew into flak that turned the sky black with explosions. They watched fighters make head-on attacks through their formations. They saw comrades die in aircraft that exploded or spiraled burning from the sky. And they kept flying because the strategy demanded it, and because they believed, correctly or not, that their sacrifice was shortening the war and saving lives in the long run. For German defenders, the experience was one of progressive, crushing realization that the war was unwinnable. The Luftwaffe pilot who had believed in 1942 that German fighters could stop any bombing campaign faced by 1944, a sky so full of enemy aircraft that destroying dozens made no difference to the raid's outcome. The flak gunner who had trained to defend his city watched it burn despite his best efforts, because there were simply too many bombers, too many targets, too much ordnance falling from too high to stop. The intelligence officer who had calculated that America could field 300 bombers stood on that observation platform in Berlin and counted 1,000 overhead, knowing that thousands more were being built and that tomorrow or the next day they would return. The story of German air defense planning and American bomber production is ultimately a story about the nature of industrial warfare between modern nations. Wars between industrialized powers are not decided primarily by tactics, doctrine, or fighting spirit, though all of these matter. They are decided by production capacity, resource availability, and the ability to sustain operations over years rather than months. Germany entered the war with technological advantages in many areas and tactical experience from years of rearmament and small-scale conflicts. These advantages won stunning victories in 1939 and 1940, but they could not overcome the fundamental disparity in industrial capacity once the United States fully mobilized its economy for war production. The mathematician who calculated that America might build 300 bombers had not made an arithmetic error. His math was correct within the assumptions he worked from. Those assumptions, based on traditional aircraft manufacturing and European industrial models, were simply inadequate to predict what American mass production could achieve. Ford's Willow Run, building a heavy bomber every hour, represented something genuinely new in warfare. It was the application of assembly line techniques to the most complex machines of the era. Once that process began, the outcome was foreordained. Germany could not match American production rates. It could not replace losses as quickly as America could inflict them. It could not sustain a defensive campaign against an opponent willing to accept casualties in pursuit of strategic goals. The officer who stood in Berlin on that morning in March 1943, counting contrails and realizing that every calculation had been wrong, was witnessing the future of warfare. Wars between great powers would be won by the side that could build more aircraft, more tanks, more ships, faster and in greater numbers than the enemy could destroy them. Courage mattered, skill mattered, technology mattered, but industrial capacity mattered more. The 2,000 American bombers over Germany in early 1945 represented not just tactical air superiority, but strategic inevitability. They were the visible manifestation of an industrial system that could produce weapons faster than any opponent could destroy them. That is why the initial German estimates mattered. Not because 300 bombers versus 1,000 bombers made a tactical difference in any single raid, though it did, but because the error in estimation reflected a failure to understand the kind of war that was being fought. Germany had prepared for a European war, a war of the scale and duration it had experienced in previous conflicts. America had prepared for industrial total war, a conflict where production capacity and economic mobilization would be as important as battlefield performance. When those two visions collided over the skies of Germany, the outcome was decided not by the battles themselves, but by the factories, the workers, the resources, and the systems that made those battles possible. The last American bombing raid on Germany occurred on April 25, 1945, 5 days before Hitler's suicide and 13 days before Germany's unconditional surrender. Over 300 bombers attacked targets around Salzburg. There was almost no opposition. The Luftwaffe was finished, grounded by lack of fuel and lack of pilots. The flak batteries fired sporadically, conserving ammunition that would not arrive in time to matter. Germany had fought the air war with everything it had. It had not been enough. The sky over Germany belonged to the Allies, and would until the war ended. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.